أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Begin this recording. I wanted to begin by firstly, let me just, because I've been sick, let me just get a little bit of water. I just wanted to begin, Bismillah, with a mention of a few different texts that will be very helpful in understanding Ibn Taymiyyah. And I wanted to point out from my limited studies of Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, there's definitely people that are what we would call experts in Ibn Taymiyyah, that they have gone through all of his fatwa, which is basically where all of his books are at. And they have done, some scholarly work to those fatwa, and or they have taught his books a number of different times. I focus myself on certain areas of Imam Ibn Taymiyyah's thought. But firstly, I wanted to mention some of the studies that are out there, and then mention some of the books that I think that are important. And these have been translated into the English language. One book that is beneficial, which is really actually, we're pointing to a section of the book, which is volume 2, Saviors of the Islamic Spirit. In Arabic is Rijal al-Fikr al-Dawah. They were originally, I think, written in Urdu by Shaykh Abul Hassan al-Nadawi, who was a historian. He wrote a book which talks about, it's multiple volumes, about 3 or 4, depending on the print. It's printed in English as well, printed in Arabic, printed in Urdu. And the book talks about different people that were known to be people of revival and reform. You don't necessarily have to agree with them or with their methodologies or their ideas, but it's an important book. I found it to be extremely beneficial because it covers a number of different thinkers, and it kind of does it in a systematic way that is not too cumbersome. It's not necessarily like so bogged down by the details of how Western academia sometimes may do, or even some of the PhD master's theses that are coming out of the Muslim world. Sometimes they bog down the point, and you can't necessarily see a big picture. With this book, you see a big picture. You begin to see there's a pattern of what we will call revival and reform. And most of it has to do with literacy. And that's an important part to think about when you think about Ibn Taymiyyah, the issue of literacy. And what we mean by literacy is getting people to be connected with Islamic knowledge. Now then, what you mean after that is, it's a different discussion. But the issue of literacy, the issue of the connection of scholarship to the people, to the people, not to be limited to a group, but to be connected to the community. That is something that is seen in mostly every biography of someone that's considered to be a reviver and a reformer, whether we agree with them or not. And there's these educational projects that they engage in. You begin to see whether it's a Sufi concept of engaging in some sort of taqi or zawiya, whatever it is, or whether it is some sort of madrasa concept, an educational institution which is focused more on book knowledge. Either way, like we said, as academics, we have to have a certain distance. And what happens in Islamic knowledge is that in today is the same thing that was happening in the time of Ibn Taymiyyah. People don't know how to separate or sift through what's beneficial from what's harmful. So that's where even the Western academy, to a certain extent, has benefit over over doing education in Islamic institution. Why? Because you may study 20 different figures, and you can study those 20 different figures in that environment, and they can be from different schools of thought, and you're looking at them just as thinkers. You're not going into it immediately with a judgment. I don't agree with this person because this person doesn't agree with my teachers or my approach or my school of thought, my aqidah, my take on the Arabic language, my point in fiqh. That type of confusion is even a confusion that we're seeing in Ibn Taymiyyah's time. We'll talk about that in his proper place. But that's just to contextualize the book of Shaykh Abul Hassan al-Nadwi, that it gives you a global understanding over time of what are some of the qualities of people that can be considered mujaddidun or muslihun. The issue of tajdeed and the issue of islah, which we call improperly in English reform, it has some qualities, and that has to be studied and understood, because mostly those concepts have been taken in the later day period and been monopolized by certain Islamic movement groups. And what happens is that you don't have a clear understanding of what that meant over time. So those concepts become very confused. Simply put, tajdeed is to revive the deen. Islah can never take place in the deen itself, in the deen. It can take place in how the knowledge of the deen is communicated, in educational reforms. It could take place in the behavior of the people. It could take place in the thinking of the people, but never in Islam itself, the core sources, the primary sources of the knowledge of Islam. Now when you talk about secondary issues, the way we present something, maybe in the Mus'haf we may be able to make it a little more systematic, but you're not going to, make reform on the Quran itself. You see what I'm saying? Maybe we may make a computer program to present it in a certain way that's easier to memorize, or maybe we may color code the letters for tajweed purposes, or maybe we may put an index at the back of the book. There's islah, and islah basically means to ameliorate or to make something better, to bring out the good in it, and that's why we never say that the deen, we're making islah of the deen. What we're doing is we're reviving the deen, mujaddid, because those practices or understandings that were there fell out of the way. So Abu Hassan Nadwi does an important thing. What he does is he gives us a historical background of certain things that were going on. And I like that when he starts off by talking about Jalaluddin Rumi, which some people say, well, what does that have to do with Ibn Taymiyyah? But he talks about how Jalaluddin Rumi, whether we agree with him or not, one of the important activities that he engaged in was to tie thinking with the heart of the believers. And one of the reasons Jalaluddin Rumi became important was because there was an over excess of engaging in rational speculation. And so Aqidah and understanding, the more core principles of Tawhid, everything became philosophical. Everything became like ultra rational, separate from life, separate from the heart, became a point of debate. It became separate from any sort of connection to Allah. You see that same problem come up again with, Al-Ghazali, who's Imam Al-Ghazali Muhammad, who is extending the work of Al-Hasibi and others. And so you have this introduction to Ibn Taymiyyah from that background, that there was this problem going on in Islamic scholarship, in the world of Islamic knowledge, where there was this trending of pushing people towards this over speculation. Now that doesn't mean everybody was doing that, but just kind of where was the trending at. So Ibn Taymiyyah comes in, that was kind of the background. The other thing is that the Muslim world was politically in chaos, and it was the problem of civil war amongst the Muslims themselves, people fighting for power and leadership and collapsing each other. And so there was this need for internal stability, right? And so I want you to read his Aqidah in light of that, because that's the same tool that we find that's used in contemporary times when they call on Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn Taymiyyah sometimes political positions with the leader. It's not, we can't always say that this is the Sunnah and that's it. We have to understand that sometimes these are positions that are representative of maybe the Sunnah in a particular contextual reality. And so you have that going on. Then you have challenges coming from the Christians. When you talk about the Crusades, so you have, the Crusades. Then you have the Tatar. Then you have the issue of integrating the Tatar. Those who are in Muslim lands, how do you integrate them? They may no longer be hostile. They actually may have taken their shahada. And then you have different Turkish tribes that are coming under the Mamelukes, in Mameluke rule, and they necessarily are not Arabic speakers, but you have this elite group that is maintaining the power. They're respectful of religion. They're the ones that are building the institutions and so on and so forth, but they're very distant from the people, and they're also distant from the original sources. It's more of not to judge people, but it's more of like the way that Abul Hassan, the way that I read is more of like a external, perfunctory. You're just looking at the form of the religion, and then along with that, you have like this spiritual, this kind of like spiritualizing of everything, and so Ibn Taymiyyah is dealing with that reality, political chaos. You know what I'm saying? And then how you integrate people who, and what we mean by integrate here, we're talking about the way Abul Hassan Nadwi and others put it, that the Tatar, even though they took their shahada and they were practicing at the basic level when it came to economic transactions, when it came to how you solve problems in the society, they were going back to their customs. They were going back to their customs. So the deen was, the way that it's painted is that the reality of the deen didn't extend beyond the basics of the pillars.
Yeah, they practiced the Mongolian law called Yasa in reality.
Right, and that's what Ibn Taymiyyah is confronting. Like, how do you deal with this phenomena that you have so many fissures meaning breaks, and so many gaps and obstacles, and towards really having a connection between deen and society as a whole. Because if it was just a matter of purification of the heart and getting people to practice and just have certain type of aqidah, he could have achieved that easily. The other issue that comes in, and this actually is brought up by my teacher who passed away, Dr. Taha Jabir Rahmatullah Alayhi, in this book that he called Ibn Taymiyyah wa Islamiyat al-Marifa. And it's available PDF. It's a very small pamphlet. And he was from the ulama of Iraq. Dr. Taha Jabir was from the ulama of Iraq. He was Azhari trained, and he had did his PhD thesis on al-Mahsul of Imam Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi. He was known to be one of the top scholars of usul fiqh in the Muslim world. And he was also known to be one of the heads of Triple IT, which is, basically in many ways was birthed in the U.S. under the guidance of a number of different scholars, along with Ismail Farouqi. Dr. Ismail Farouqi, who passed away, who was كان مؤسس للدراسات الإسلامية في جامعة Temple in Philadelphia. He was the one that established Islamic studies in Temple University, and he impacted education in Malaysia, whatever. So they're the ones that published it. So he notes, because he did his PhD thesis, Dr. Taha Jabir, on Fakhr ad-Din Razi, and he also knows the climate of Islamic scholarship in some instances. So he was talking about how in Iraq, Ibn Taymiyyah was anathema to bring up. And also he had told me personally, he told me that when he finished doing all his research on Fakhr ad-Din Razi, that he had arrived at his own opinions. And when he presented it in Al-Azhar, some of the mashaykh were like, who are you to criticize Shaykh al-Islam Fakhr ad-Din Razi? He says, basically, I'm the one who has devoted my life to the study of Fakhr ad-Din Razi and did this PhD thesis on Fakhr ad-Din Razi. I went to the whole of the Mahsul and everything that takes, and I've studied all my life. And this is what gives me the right to take a position. I'm giving you that background to say that when he talks about Ibn Taymiyyah, he got kicked out of Saudi for criticizing Ibn Taymiyyah as well. You know, in Saudi, at a certain point, they even wanted to ban him completely, but then his book from being published. That's why Triple IT published that section on Ibn Taymiyyah, because that section was supposed to be part of his thesis. And so when they took up in Saudi the project of publishing his thesis, which Saudi published it on the Fakhr ad-Din Razi's Mahsul, is in multiple volumes. They left out the criticism of Ibn Taymiyyah. So one of the things that he brought up was that he didn't criticize Ibn Taymiyyah in necessarily a negative way, but he had his own understandings. He was developing into his own intellectual, positions. But one of the things that he mentioned is that the time of Fakhr ad-Din Razi was problematic to some extent, and that is because they began to elevate al-dalil al-aqli above al-dalil al-naqli. And what that means is that knowledge that's considered to be evidence that's rational was given status above knowledge which is considered to be an evidence which is transmitted, which is basically knowledge of the Quran, the Sunnah. And that's an
Reason
important
versus revelation.
reason versus revelation. And so that becomes the issue where Ibn Taymiyyah is coming in that climate. And so he's coming in that climate where the Asharis and the Hanbalis are at war with each other. And that's important to have an understanding that you're not going to get a really solid insight into the Hanbali positions or the Ashari positions, because most of what is written in this time period and thereafter is all about justifying their polemics. So it's not that easy as a student of knowledge to get a critical position which is able to weigh out what was going on and how to understand it. So one of the things that Abu Hassan Nadwi says is that the Hanbali position was looked at as a position of weakness intellectually, because you have this climate. You have this intellectual climate which has a certain taste. There's a certain, just like right now, if you were to put out a poster on Facebook or there's a certain standard that people have. And when it doesn't meet that standard, they automatically will reject it, even if it's nice, even if it has its own
And the
rank.
standard was hyper rationalizing everything.
Right.
So if you weren't doing that, you were seen as being kind of stupid, or maybe like how we would think of like a hillbilly redneck nowadays who rejects anything intellectual.
Yeah, all that aside, the hillbilly redneck stuff, but they were in an environment which was chaos, politically, spiritually, culturally. That's how the historians paint it. And then in that midst, the ulama were distant from the people, because the people on average are not going to sit down. Even there's a story about the student Fakhr ad-Din Razi and the encounter with an old lady, or an older person, actually was an older gentleman, they say. And so something happened with the encounter between the man and Fakhr's students or whatever. And so one of the students basically says, "You don't know who that is? That's Fakhr ad-Din Razi. Man, Fakhr ad-Din Razi, he has X amount of proofs for the existence of Allah." And so the people, they were on their fitrah. They had a connection with Allah without having to go to that stuff. Intellectual proofs or even deep scholarly knowledge and debates and this and that, not to take away from intellectual proofs. But he told them something simple. He said, for as many proofs as you need for the existence of Allah, that means you doubted all of those times. You had so many doubts, so that you needed to establish proofs in order to remove those doubts from your mind. And so there was this idea that there was a disconnection from the people. So all that to say, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah is writing in that. Even Imam al-Nawawi rahmatullahi alayhi is in this time period, close to his time period. And Imam Nawawi was given a hard time, because he had criticized the way that the political leadership was acting. They wanted to. They were the way that Abu Hassan Nadwi characterizes the Mamluks was that they were military dictators, and they themselves didn't also govern by Sharia. But Ibn Taymiyyah supported what they were doing because they brought some stability. They brought stability to the region, in Egypt, especially in Syria, Sudan. It gave some stability.
They were closer
Because,
to Sharia than any of the other rulers at the time, even though they weren't perfect.
right, and so there was chaos everywhere, and you had more support for the deen than what you were seeing before. So it was something that was acceptable to Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah came from a family of scholarship. Most of them were Hanabila, and his grandfather was a scholar. His father was basically a scholar. His grandfather was the one that compiled the Muntaka. And the Muntaka is basically one of the references for the Hanbali madhab in Hadith. Before basically it's up there with the Musnad Imam
You said this
Ahmed,
was his grandfather?
his grandfather.
He wrote a book
Abdul
named
Hamid.
Muntaqa,
Majduddin.
and then the grandson's name is Taqiyuddin. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Same root.
and his father was known to be an Imam Khatib in Damascus. They had left Iraq, which was basically at that time where the city is now is Turkey. But at that time, it was considered to be part of Iraq, Turkey. All that region was pretty much the same region. And they left there because of the political instability. But his family comes from what we call Asr al-Buyut. And that's when, in the time period of of households that contained the knowledge of Islam, generation upon generation. So he was very grounded in the Hanbali madhab. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the things that we need to understand is that he's coming up in this historical background, but he reaches a level of ijtihad, and this a lot of times is not given to him as credit. He's not. It's not like he's not coming from a very grounded background in understanding fiqh and so on and so forth. They say that he reached the level of the Arabic language that was also ijtihad. That he had read Sibawayh's book El Kitab, and he criticized some of his positions.
So that was
one
the
of
major Arabic grammar book.
that was one of the highest levels, and even until today, still considered one of the highest levels of grammar to study. And so, one of the things that Imam Ibn Taymiyyah did was that he took the Hanbali positions and he gave it umph, which actually made him a stronger Ashari than many of the Asharis, because he achieved something that the Asharis claimed to wanted to achieve, which was a balance between reason and revelation, or between textual evidences and rational evidences, which many of them never really reached mastery of hadith and so on and so forth. Some of them did. You can say Athari, but I don't want to get into all that, but the position, if you want to go that route, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah was one of the ones that began to reassert the position of the companions, the Athar, which is not that any other scholar didn't do it. But what makes Ibn Taymiyyah unique, right, is that Ibn Taymiyyah gave their position almost like a madhab-like status, which is something that voices, when we look at Shaykh Ramadan al-Buti, rahmatullahi alayhi, he likes to argue against that. Did the Sahaba have a madhab? Yes, they had madhab. Even in Al-Azhar, they say that. So Shaykh Ramadan al-Buti, as much as we love him and respect him, we disagree on that point that they didn't have madhab. They had madhab. Now, did those madhab follow the same exact system that the later day schools of thought follow? No, not exactly always like that. But Aisha has her opinions, Ibn Umar has his opinions, Ibn Mas'ud has his opinions, Umar has his opinions, and they even have their usul, their principles, as how they arrive at those positions. So it's not fair to say they didn't have madhab. So Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, in that regard, he brought out their positions, and then along with the four madhab, and so that he centralized hadith, and this is what we talk about in the role of fiqh. What he did in fiqh was that he centralized hadith to such a way that he reviewed many of the positions that were taken, and he showed where there was actually maybe a consensus or where there was no consensus between the scholars. And so Abu Hassan Nadwi says that at this point there was not a real issue at this time. It was not a real issue between the madhab. That comes up periodically, the fight between the madhab and fiqh. But here he says they had like a tolerance for each other. Where the real issue was more the bigotry that would emerge at times. And you see that more and more later on, like, my imam should be followed. Some of the scholars start getting into that, and then your imam is not like my imam. They started getting into that more later, but there was some more of a little ground for tolerance. But it was more on the issue of aqidah. It was more the fight between the Hanabila and the Ash'ira or the Asharis. And then what you began to see were other groups like the Batani movement, similar to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. What Abu Hamid was going through in this regard, that he was dealing with all these different trends and ideas. And Ibn Taymiyyah had to do the same. He had to engage the Christians, he engaged the Jews, he engaged the philosophers, he engaged the Shia, he engaged the Ashari school, he engaged most of the Mu'tazila, most of the schools of Ilm al-Kalam that he had to deal with. And so it was there where he reconstructed. And in reconstructing, Ibn Taymiyyah, what he did was separate Ibn Taymiyyah, and I'll give it a couple minutes and then open it up. What he began to do was he began to criticize the usage of logic, right? And we have an abridged version of Ibn Taymiyyah's book in Logic, translated into English by Wa'il Halak, in which Wa'il Halak gives an introduction to the book. It's an important shift. Why? Because what Ibn Taymiyyah said was that you guys over-relied on logical argumentation to prove points in Aqidah. On top of that, you didn't master Hadith enough in order to prove your positions. Like you were more focused on philosophy, and you were missing some points where there's textual evidences to cover some ground on Hadith. Doesn't mean we agree or disagree. We're just trying to give a description. But in his shifting away from logic and philosophy to prove Aqidah, he focused heavily on Quran and the Sunnah. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is that Ibn Taymiyyah relied heavy on the Arabic language. Another thing that he did was he relied heavy on the Quran itself to establish ideas. So certain concepts, he would do a study of the Quran and then extract from the Quran meanings and definitions, which was not really being done by those that were following Ilm al-Kalam. They were using what the syllogism and logical rules for establishing terminology. Ibn Taymiyyah said, no, terminology has to be established based on a survey of the Quran and a Hadith. And that's where he began to clash with the other ulama, especially in issues of Aqidah. On the front that he had positions in the Arabic language, and he began to say that you guys overemphasize metaphor to the point where you took it way beyond what it was original intent. And so he began to say that there's no metaphor in the Arabic language. And basically, and some say that it's not that he totally denied metaphors, that he was saying that if you're going to talk about metaphor, you have to look at the usage of how it was used before you, by those that came before you. And so he took positions of that were following the Arabists or the linguists that were basically saying no. They were limiting what metaphor is in the Arabic language. Why? Because now you can stick more to the more external literal meanings, and there's not too much debate about what something means, because then you can establish the meaning either through the Quran, or you can establish the meaning through the usages of the poets of the past, or some usage that was established in the past. So that gives room for eliminating a lot of the speculation that we saw coming in from the esoterics or the Batiniya or other groups that were emptying out the literal meanings of the Quran and giving it secret meanings. And some of the Shia groups and some of the Sufi groups, and also even some of the philosophers and the Ilm al-Kalam. So Ibn Taymiyyah, by doing that, he shifted the foundation of Aqidah, and he what he did is he took the Hanbali position but defended it philosophically. He defended it philosophically. And by doing that, he saved us from the problem of what happens when the argument doesn't hold, or what happens when the philosophy shifts, which is a problem that takes place in Catholicism in the modern age. It takes place in other schools of Aqidah. It's happening even with those who follow the Ash'ari school. They have to, because they're basing themselves on or the Maturidis, they're basing themselves on a philosophical foundation. They have to prove their philosophy before other philosophies. Ibn Taymiyyah said, I don't have to prove my philosophy before other philosophies, because what I believe in is in revelation, and I stick to the basics of what revelation says who Allah is. Now, if you want to hear what I have to say philosophically, go to my book, Dar al-Ta'arud Bayn al-Aql wa Naql, that there's no contradiction between reason and revelation. And so then he, in that book, which is hardly read by because it's a difficult book, it's multi-volume, he argues that. So Ibn Taymiyyah's contribution is that he gave us this idea that reason can be found in revelation. And he gave us this idea that reason can be used to establish Aqidah, but how? If you establish prophethood rationally, then what should follow as a consequence is that you believe your prophet, that your prophet is not a liar. So if your prophet is not a liar, then your prophet, you're saying your prophet has prophethood, revelation comes, in this case, the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, then the Quran, comes from that believing in prophethood. But prophethood is established rationally, which is not like the other schools of Aqidah. The other schools of Aqidah say you have to establish the existence of Allah first, or you have to have an experience with Allah. Right? So Ibn Taymiyyah says, no, it's much more simple than that. If you believe that prophets exist, and in this case, the Prophet Muhammad, then you have to believe in what he brings you. And so from there, he gives Aqidah a different foundation. One of the things that he does for us is give us the route to establish thinking based on the Quran and extract from the Quran ideas and concepts. And so, the other thing that he gives us is this idea that we can look at the four madahib, and we can go back and look at the positions of the Sahaba, and we can take benefit from them. You know what I'm saying? And we can see where there's congruence or where there's no congruence, where that wasn't really being done anymore. What was happening in the madhahib is that they were just looking at what their scholars had said. He reasserted the fiqh of the Sahaba along with the madhahib. So the other book to mention as a reference point is the Hanbali school, and by Dr. Abdul Hakim al-Maturidi, which is PDF, you can find it. It's a very good study on the Hanbali school, and he talks about Ibn Taymiyyah as well. Another book to study is Muslims Under Non-Muslim Rules by Dr. Yahya Shou, who refutes those who talk about that Ibn Taymiyyah is an extremist, and how it is that a lot of violence was justified in Ibn Taymiyyah's name, but in reality it was distortions of his thought. Now, of the books that I think are important, all of them are in the Arabic, the Arabic and English, but in the English language, with pretty solid translations, is The Removal of Blame, by Dr. Abdul Hakim Maturidi. He was the one that translated it. It's Ibn Taymiyyah's text. It's not an easy read, but that's an important book in the study of usul, al-fiqh, and hadith, and differences amongst the ulama. There, Ibn Taymiyyah defends Abu Hanifa and other ulama, and he talks about why is it that some of the ulama may not accept certain hadith. And he gives a number of rules. Dr. Yahya Michot, Michot. And so in Removal of Blame, that's an important book because you get to see Ibn Taymiyyah operating in hadith, in fiqh and usul all at the same time. So methodologically is an important book for the student of knowledge from that angle. And you can find the PDF, it's on the archive and everything. And the other book is Principles of Tafsir, Usul, as Usul al-Tafsir. In that book, the one that's most popular is the one that is commented on by Shaykh Uthaymeen, is translated into English. The English is okay. I mean, we need other translations of it, but there he gives you some basics of what he considers to be a theory of knowledge at the beginning of the book. And he talks about the role of opinion and reason and the role of revelation, and then he talks about the importance of athari tafsir. To me, that part is okay. It is what it is. To me, that they say that he read 100 tafsirs and one ayah. To me, that doesn't mean much, because in tafsir literature, most of it is taqlid. Most of them are saying the same thing over and over again. So you can read 100 tafsir and you may only get two ideas.
They copy and paste from each other a lot.
They copy and paste from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, but this is important because he talks about methodologically how he views dealing with tafsir. And if you really want to understand Ibn Taymiyyah, you have to understand his methodology more than what Shaykh so-and-so said and so and so forth. The other book which I had a personal experience with is Al-Hamawiyah. Al-Hamawiyah. The translation may not be that great, but it's there. But Al-Hamawiyah is amazing from what angle? Not necessarily for me what positions he reaches in Aqidah, but because Ibn Taymiyyah uses history to trace ideas. So he's doing like what some people will call genealogy, even though when I mentioned that to Yahya Mashow, he almost fell out of his seat because that's more of a contemporary. He said more the history of ideas. But Ibn Taymiyyah teaches you how to trace an idea back and to see how it is that it develops. Right. And all those points, understanding how hadith is used, how language is used, understanding how a position is constructed, understanding how the Quran may be approached, and understanding how to trace ideas, that stuff is what builds the student of knowledge. And of course there's many others that can talk about Ibn Taymiyyah, in a much more in-depth scholarly way. But those experiences, are important for you to have. And al-isma al-mal al-anbiya, infallibility is with the prophets. And so a lot of Ibn Taymiyyah, sometimes the reason why there's a lot of launching against him is because Ibn Taymiyyah criticized Ibn Arabi. And so when he criticized Ibn Arabi, he created a new foundation for tazkiyah or tasawwuf, which was more based on, similar to Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, is more focused on textual evidence and more simplified than what was being aimed at by other people like Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. And so that left a bad taste in a lot of Sufis' mouths. The other thing is that Ibn Taymiyyah criticized later day Asharis. Ibn Taymiyyah, in my opinion, is a true Ashari because he combines reason and a revelation. Imam Ahmed wasn't writing like Ibn Taymiyyah. That was more of a Baqalani and the Ashari schools. They were the ones that were writing like that. They were justifying their positions with textual evidences and rational evidences. Textual evidences mean Quran, Sunnah, so on and so forth, and statements of the companions or Athar. But because he criticized a lot of later day positions in the Ashari school, they had issues with him. Another thing is that the Asharis refused to accept certain positions that he came to. You know what I'm saying? And so that becomes part of the dilemma. You know what I'm saying? That becomes part of the dilemma as to why it is that the scholars sometimes they create an environment of intolerance. And if we follow the position that no one is infallible, then okay, we take, like Imam Malik said, and we reject from everyone except the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? But Ibn Taymiyyah on the front of creating a system outside of logic, outside of the logic that was dominant at the time, and using the Arabic language and using the Quran, and using another system that was revolutionary, in many instances. And that's why a lot of people that want to take to reviving the deen, they look to people like Ibn Taymiyyah to try to get an idea of where do we go when we want reform. And there's no doubt that the Muslims were challenged politically, and they were challenged externally, and they were challenged intellectually, similar to today's time still. You know what I'm saying? So Ibn Taymiyyah still has a lot to offer on that front, as long as we don't take him to be like a prophet. He's not a prophet, and so he's not infallible, and everything that he says may not always be on point, but that doesn't mean also that everything that he says is to be rejected. I don't know if anybody had any.
A really important point, though. It seems like a lot of schools of Islamic thought, and I'm not just talking about like madhabs, whether it be Deoband or Barelvi or Muslim Brotherhood or whoever, they kind of have to come to terms with how do we deal with these three big strains of thought represented by like Ibn Taymiyyah, Fakhruddin al-Razi, or Ibn Arabi. How do we reconcile those three aspects of our tradition?
Well, one of the things that we have to remember is that those are ijtihadat. And we're not obligated to ijtihadat to believe in them like their revelation. And so that's part of the dilemma that we encounter, right? That that we take sometimes the ijtihadat of the ulama and we make them qat'i, or we make them absolute. And so part of the challenge of the student of knowledge in the 21st century, so to speak, is to be able to be grounded in textual familiarity, right? And knowing that the text, like the Quran itself, has its own methodology. And you will find different approaches in the ahadith and to dealing with people and situations and this and that. So the Sunnah has its own methodology, and then how to deal with Quran and Sunnah. And then you have how you deal with the statements of the scholars, how you deal with the methodologies of the scholars. That knowledge is taught, but it is not a discipline yet. It's taught they talk about it. It began to be written in Al-Azhar. كيف نتعامل مع التراث? How do we work with the tradition, or I don't like saying tradition, but the scholarly inheritance? How do we deal with the scholarly inheritance? And so there's principles that are developed by the scholars, like نقف على مناهجهم ولا نقف على مسائلهم, that we basically rely, or that we fall back on, or that we look at their overall methodology. We don't get caught up in their individual ijtihadat. Sometimes when people criticize Ibn Taymiyyah,
different extremist groups would cherry pick stuff from Ibn Taymiyyah, yes, but not be completely devoid of any of his methodology. And
that's what Yahya Mashal, that's what Dr. Yahya Mashal deals with. Mm-hmm. And Muslims and the non-Muslim rule, how they distorted Ibn Taymiyyah's thought in that regard. But a lot of people do it. Mm-hmm. Even you began to see that in Saudi scholarship. You know what I'm saying? In Saudi scholarship, not everyone was completely grounded in Ibn Taymiyyah. And so they would basically use Ibn Taymiyyah to knock off the Ash'aris, say Ibn Taymiyyah argued against y'all, and his arguments are strong. But intellectually, they didn't have positions. That's why a lot of their youth began to have confusion, because they didn't have a bridge on how do you deal with intellectual ideas. So they would take parts and accept parts. You see what I'm saying? Or some people will criticize Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah, from the Sufi side, and they will never see how Ibn Taymiyyah, I had a teacher who did his PhD thesis in Ibn Arabi, right? From Al-Azhar. And so he was saying that Ibn Arabi has some positions that are obscure, and basically the positions are so unclear that it's hard to determine what it is that he's taking or what it is that he's saying. He was saying Ibn Taymiyyah was very just in his criticism of the Sufis. So this is coming from a person that had studied Ibn Arabi, on in an academic, systematic way, and he's looking at Ibn Taymiyyah not necessarily as an enemy or necessarily the Imam only to be fought. But he's saying, look, Ibn Taymiyyah has some just criticism, of some of the Sufis. That criticism was taken up by Zarruq, not maybe Ibn Taymiyyah's criticism, but Zarruq criticized the Sufis. Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanawi, he criticized the Sufis. Al-Ghazali even criticizes the Sufis. All the Sufis are criticizing each other. So just because Ibn Taymiyyah has a criticism of the Sufis doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad thing. They all have criticisms.
And as you mentioned, he followed the Sufi tariqah from Abdul Qadir Jilani. So in a sense, he's criticizing Sufis from within Sufism too. Even though he's labeled nowadays as an outsider, right?
Ibn Taymiyyah never married. Ibn Taymiyyah never married. And he never married, and Nawawi never married. And those who never married, mostly they devoted themselves to ibadah and knowledge, which is a form of ibadah and serving the Muslim community. So he lived a very simple lifestyle in that regard.
I think we should open it up to general Q&A. So if any of the students have any questions, now is the time. Salman, Mustahid, Shannon, anybody got questions? Hamza.
So I started typing this, but it takes a long time and I hate silence on these things. So I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the topic. Because, yeah, you were saying Ibn Taymiyyah is kind of painted as this one picture, depending on which group you're in or which group you're listening to. And so it's really helpful to kind of have like a broader view of him as a person in the community that he was responding to. And I mean, just with every single Islamic science, and history included, and probably especially, having that greater context and having that greater perspective really helps us to not fall into the simplistic thinking of this person bad, this person good, which we see that a lot in the community. And so it's something that I kind of always have on my mind of like, how can we quell this very simplistic thinking? And I don't know if there's a real easy answer, but it's helpful to have some more of this perspective. So thank you very much for bringing the information that you had today and the book choices, and I already put in my book order, so we're good to go.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to that a little bit, what Shannon said. May Allah bless you. That has been a struggle that I've had for the last over 20 years now. I don't think creating an environment that is intellectually tolerant, so to speak, and grounded at the same time, not meaning tolerant and everything goes, but people having positions but still respecting others, or at least knowing how to benefit what ideas. That's just not where the Muslim community is at, and that's definitely not where the masajid are at, and that's definitely not where the internet is at. So the only space really that you have is some sort of academic setting, which the teacher sets the tone for that. But the teacher setting the tone for that is for the students themselves to be able to develop that and carry that so that they can appreciate Islam, Islamic knowledge. But that environment we have yet to see that. And I don't think we're going to see that for a long time, because a lot of the strife that you see in the Muslim world, it was easily provoked, without getting into a lot of the geopolitical stuff. But a lot of the face value strife is sectarian stuff, even though there's other stuff behind that. But that's easily provoked. The sectarian conflicts are easily provoked because of the intellectual state of the Muslims, and where people are at and where scholarship is at. And so, but we can't afford to have that mindset, especially if you come from a convert background, especially teaching your children that And not just converts, but everybody in general. But the reason why I mentioned converts is because converts have a lot of work that they're doing on moving and adapting themselves, and so you can't have that intellectual tension, or you can't afford to be harboring hostility within yourself because it's too much pressure. And that's what causes people not to be able to rely back on Islam when they hit crisis moments, because intellectually they don't know how to navigate ideas. I don't know if that makes sense, but you can give me some feedback on that if it didn't make sense.
I think
you
it
have to
did.
have
Being
that clarity.
firmly grounded helps us deal with crises in life. Firmly grounded in the Islamic tradition.
Well, and I think too, having that flexibility of thought, I work with a lot of converts, so I see this happen a lot of people come in, they have that zeal from the beginning, and we're sold this idea that Islam is so simple that a 2-year-old can understand it. So then when we're given these ideas of like, this guy bad, this guy good, listen to this guy, don't listen to that guy, it's easy for converts to fall into that. And the people, at least from an anecdotal perspective, the people that I see that really subscribe to that, 10 years later, they're not Muslim because
Yes.
they don't have the flexibility of thought to
Right.
then kind of meet people and you're like, wow, my neighbor's really nice to me and the people at the masjid are awful. Or,
Right.
how to handle family or whatever, this rigidness and thinking of what's okay, what's not okay. And of course there's boundaries, but like we make those boundaries too small. And so that doesn't offer people, like you said, this way of thinking, this flexibility to maneuver through life in such a way that we can maintain our faith.
Right. And that's really complicated. That really needs it really needs a platform in which we can talk about that at a more detailed level, or at least in a more broad way. And I know that Salman mentioned that he never heard anybody say Ibn Taymiyyah was Ashari, and I wanted to comment on that. What I mean by that is that Imam al-Ashari in his school, the methodology was supposed to be a balance between reason and revelation, reason and the text. And so if you take that methodology, in reality, that is Ashari, even though on some positions, Ibn Taymiyyah may have positions that clash with the Ashari school, but the general framework like that, no, it doesn't clash with the Ashari school if we were to be truthful, of the reality, and move away from the polemics, because it's definitely not Hanbali. The Hanbali school, most of their creedal primers or most of their texts in Aqidah that are basic, what you're seeing is just a lot of narration, and a lot of texts are. That's why they say that the Athari Aqidah doesn't change much, because most of them are narrating the same thing. You know what I'm saying? They're not really taking up issues. Whereas Ibn Taymiyyah, he took up issues. Ibn Taymiyyah, that's another thing that's important about Ibn Taymiyyah's scholarship, that he was a scholar that addressed the issues of his time as he saw it. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with it. But one thing that we can't disagree with is this idea of knowledge having an aspect of it which is addressing the contextual reality of life. Yes, there's the idea of knowledge for knowledge's sake, or knowledge to serve knowledge, and so on and so forth. And that is kind of more on, more stuff that has to do with like graduate thinking or higher level processing of knowledge or whatever, if you want to go outside of the university system. But the idea of knowledge serving community interests, most of his books in Aqidah that he wrote, it was always a response to a question that people had. It was never just a philosophical speculation divorced from what was going on.
He was an
And so
activist scholar in a sense.
he was he was definitely an activist guy. Ibn Taymiyyah got in military scuffles as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So he wasn't an activist scholar. He was kind of like this idea of, remember that the Crusaders operated like that as well. The Crusade That was just a reality of the time. You know what I'm saying? That people were into knowledge, they were into changing things and so on and so forth. And that's just the reality of the day.
I have a question. When you say, it's famous that like Ibn Taymiyyah was against logic, but what types of logic or forms of logic did he criticize?
Ibn Taymiyyah wasn't against logic in my short reading of that. What Ibn Taymiyyah was against was the over dependence to claim that logic produces truth. And it's true, logic does not produce truth. A logical argument doesn't mean that it's a truthful argument. And the syllogistic logic is about plugging things in the right order, and then you get a conclusion.
It's a
And so
formula.
yeah, it's a formula. And so yes, logic versus rationality is a good way to put it. So man, put that there. So Ibn Taymiyyah was also against this idea that was much more detailed from my limited understanding, which has a lot to do with the psychology of knowledge. How do we process knowledge? It has to do with epistemology, but it has to do with the way that the psyche understands knowledge. So Ibn
Pedagogy.
Taymiyyah was, yeah, he was arguing this idea that you don't need to construct a definition according to the system of the logicians in order to understand. He was saying you can understand without having this definition that's constructed. That's important because they were constructing definitions, people. They had rules to how you construct the definition because that scholarship in many ways was scientific. This is terminology and rules and principles and concepts. When you have an idea,
So
and
they
those
made
ideas are
social
brought together.
constructs that kind of blinded their view in a sense. And Ibn Taymiyyah was trying to destroy those
I wouldn't say social constructs. I would say that they were
categories of
intention.
knowledge.
Yeah, they were categories of knowledge. It was very similar to what Aristotle was doing. But what they did was they were saying that basically you can't have an understanding of knowledge if you don't have a definition. And Ibn Taymiyyah disagreed with that psychologically. The other thing that he was saying is that you guys are imposing these set of rules. You have to create a definition by following point 1, point 2, point 3. Then you are able to have a concept. Then you're able to think because you have a clear concept based on those clear
Yeah,
definitions, right?
Mu'tazila did the same thing, so I get it.
And yeah, so he was saying, hold on a second, you guys just based a concept on an idea that you engineered rationally.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's saying one of the things that I think that he's saying is that you're evading doing a survey of the Quran itself and seeing what the Quran is saying. You see what I'm saying about different concepts, whether it's the human being or love or the value reflection or whatever it may be. How was it that you're not producing your concepts rooted in the Quran itself directly? You're rooting your concepts in rational speculation, which is divorce of really having to engage revelation. That's what Ibn Taymiyyah was against when it comes to logic. And even though he criticizes Shaykh al-Albani doesn't believe that Ibn.
Sorry, you cut out there for a moment, but we
Yeah,
have you now.
yeah. Shaykh al-Albani doesn't believe that Ibn Taymiyyah was against the metaphor. He says that no, what Ibn Taymiyyah was against was the excess of metaphor that was being used to bankrupt the meanings of the Quran. It's like the way that the Bible, anybody comes and they interpret it as they will. You know what I'm saying? And so that's a claim. That's a claim that's made. You know what I'm saying?
So
That
Ibn Taymiyyah, he was saying that in order to properly understand metaphor, you have to know how it was used during the time of the Prophet,
and
and not
if
how
it
it's
was
used now.
right, and so if it was used in that way, then it's not a metaphor. That's the usage. You see what I'm saying? Even if it moves away from the literal meaning, that's how they used it. So we have to understand that we as Muslims, this is very important for the student of knowledge, both male and female, to really grasp this point. We have something that no other community on the face of the earth has. We have access to language that's living. The Arabic language is the oldest living language on the face of the earth with continuity. There's older languages like Sanskrit and other, but that's a dead language. So, there's other languages that go back into the African continent and so on and so forth. There's other types of language like Chinese, which uses pictographs. It doesn't operate off of the same logic that we have. I think his name is Steelman or something like that. He's a Northern European scholar. He did a comparison between Greek and Hebrew thought. You can find the PDF online. It's a small book, very scholarly. I came across it over 30 years ago, where he talks about Greek thought has a certain philosophy embedded into it about movement and so on and so forth versus Hebrew thought. And so you have to realize that type of subtlety, where you're looking at how language opens up to certain ways of seeing things. You have to realize that we have access to the Arabic language. We have access to Arabic poetry, narratives, dictionaries. We have access to the usage of how the language was being employed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we also have the language as a living reality.
And in some ways, we have more information about Arabic now than ever before, as they've documented so many inscriptions that are pre-Islamic and all that.
Yeah, and we can bring it together and so on and so forth. What has happened in this time period in the Ummah is that we've never had a period in which we have so many little Arabic speakers and users, because you have the Desi community is very big on the Arabic language, but they approach it as a dead language. They study it as a dead language. They study it the way the Latin is studied as a dead language. They don't study it as a living language. Then in the Arabic speaking communities, many of them are not speaking Fusha. Many of them are speaking dialects which have been codified as languages by the colonial powers. But still, that's the tragedy. But the promise and the hope is that we have access to the language. And so because of that, a lot of these things in scholarship, we have to realize that we're blessed because we can access the Quran after 2 years of Arabic. We're going to try to access the Bible manuscripts, whatever exists of them, after 2 years of studying language. You see what I'm saying? At minimum, you won't be able to do it. And so that's an important point. And so Ibn Taymiyyah was very focused on that angle, on the angle of give the language its role, its place. You know what I'm saying? Don't totally dismiss it over philosophy. You know what I'm saying? And in his time period, the language was being dismissed off of based on philosophical modes of thought. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if that makes sense, but
it made sense for me at least. It is time now. We're gonna have to end the class. Would you do a little closing dua for us?
We ask Allah Ta'ala, the master of Ibrahim, to give us understanding. We ask Allah Ta'ala to grant us courage, like the courage of Yunus. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to grant us closeness, like the closeness of Jesus, of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to have the understanding and the ibadah of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, and to die in the state of Islam, and to increase us in knowledge, and to grant us the grace of the tawfiq to put it into practice. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to facilitate for us our rizq, our provisions, especially our wealth, our money, our health, and a wise usage of time. And we ask Allah Ta'ala for our hearts to be in a state of peace. And we send salawat on the Prophet Muhammad, and we ask Allah to forgive us our sins. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallahu khair for coming and
Barakallahu
talking
feekum.
to us.
Thank you, brother.